For centuries, just hearing the name Assyria was enough to make kings tremble. I mean, these guys were the ancient world's original superpower. They totally mastered the art of conquest. But how? How did they get so incredibly powerful?
Well, that's the big question, right? Because they didn't start out on top. They built this thing from the ground up, creating an empire that would literally define an entire era. So let's dive in and break down their blueprint for building a superpower piece by piece.
All right, Section 1, Ancient Mesopotamia's Superpower. From a small city to a mighty empire. So our story kicks off in northern Mesopotamia. And really, to get who the Assyrians were, you've got to understand where they lived. It was a place that basically forged them into one of the toughest peoples in history.
So they were located in this really fertile area, right in modern-day Iraq. Great for growing food, but there was a huge catch. The land was flat and wide open. No mountains, no major deserts to protect them. This meant they were a constant, easy target for invaders. So, from day one, they had a choice: get tough or get conquered. They chose to get tough.
Now, this didn't happen overnight, not at all. For a long time, they were just a small city-state called Ashur, mostly focused on trade. Then, over centuries, they grew into a pretty respectable regional kingdom. But then, around 911 BCE, everything changed. A new dynasty of seriously ambitious kings took over, kicking off what we called the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And that is when they became the unstoppable force of nature that history remembers.
Okay, next up, building the ultimate army, the secrets behind their military dominance. So, what was their secret weapon? Well, it all started with their military. And look, the Assyrians didn't just have an army. They built the most advanced, professional, and terrifying fighting machine the world had ever seen up to that point.
And here's the first huge difference. Think about it. Most of their enemies had armies made of farmers. You know, guys who were called up to fight when needed and then went back to their fields. The Assyrians? Nope. They created a professional, full-time army. These were soldiers who did nothing but train all year round. That gave them a massive edge in discipline, skill, you name it.
And then they combine that professional training with a game-changing new technology. See, the world was shifting from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And what you need to know about iron is that it's just so much harder and more durable than bronze. The Assyrians jumped on this early and really mastered how to use it for war.
And this iron arsenal made their soldiers incredibly deadly. We're talking harder swords that wouldn't snap in a fight, stronger spearheads, and armor-piercing arrows with iron tips, plus they had sturdy iron helmets and coats of mail for protection. It was a total mismatch. Imagine showing up to a fight with bronze and facing an army decked out in iron. You just didn't stand a chance.
But it wasn't just about the gear. It was how they used it. They had these heavy chariots that were basically the ancient world's version of a tank. They just smashed right into the enemy lines, creating pure chaos and panic. And they didn't stop with chariots. They also perfected using cavalry, soldiers on horseback. This meant they could chase down enemies in places where the heavy chariots couldn't go, like hills or rough ground. So you had this 1-2 punch. The chariots break the enemy line, and the cavalry hunts down anyone who tries to run. Super effective.
All right, let's talk about how to conquer the unconquerable. Because, you know, it's one thing to win a battle on an open field, but the real test back then was taking down a walled city. And let me tell you, nobody, and I mean nobody, was better at this than the Assyrians.
So we're talking about siege warfare. That's the whole strategy of surrounding and attacking a city. Now, most armies would just camp outside and try to starve the city out, which could take months or even years. The Assyrians? They were way too impatient for that. They were engineers of destruction. They didn't wait. They actively tore the city's defenses apart.
They had a whole playbook for this. First, they'd roll up these enormous armored battering rams to just smash the gates to bits. At the same time, they'd bring in movable siege towers, letting their soldiers attack the defenders right on top of the walls. They even dug tunnels underneath the foundations to make the walls just collapse. It was a methodical, terrifying process.
But honestly, their single most powerful weapon wasn't wood or iron. It was fear, pure psychological warfare. They made it a point to be incredibly brutal to any city that dared to resist them. And they made sure the story spread. The goal was simple: make other cities so terrified that they'd surrender without even putting up a fight.
Okay, so you've conquered this huge territory. Now what? Let's get into how they ruled a massive empire. Because conquering is one thing,
But actually running the whole show, that takes a whole different kind of genius. And they had a really brilliant system. First, they divided their huge empire into smaller, manageable provinces, each with a loyal governor. Then, they built a massive network of roads so troops and information could travel fast. They even had a messenger relay system, kind of like an ancient Pony Express with fresh horses waiting at stations, so the king could get news and send orders at incredible speeds. It was all about communication and control.
And the heart of this empire was its capital, Nineveh. This wasn't just a city, it was a statement. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, designed from the ground up to scream power. Everything about it, from its giant walls to its sprawling palaces, was meant to awe and intimidate. And if you walked up to one of these palaces, you'd be greeted by these incredible statues called lamassu. They're these giant winged bulls with human heads. Their job was basically twofold: to look absolutely intimidating to any visitors and to symbolically protect the king.
But here's the twist. The Assyrians weren't just warriors. Inside one of the palaces at Nineveh, archaeologists found something amazing: a library, not of scrolls, but of clay tablets. And not just a few, more than 30,000 of them. This was the library of King Ashurbanipal, and it was incredible. He sent scholars all over the empire to collect knowledge on everything: science, medicine, magic, you name it. In fact, the only reason we can read the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's first great stories, is because a copy was preserved in that very library.
So, now for the final chapter, the Great Empire's Collapse. Why even superpowers fall. For about 300 years, the Assyrian Empire looked completely unbeatable. But as we know from history, no empire lasts forever.
So what happened? Well, it was kind of a perfect storm of problems. For one, the empire just got too big to defend. All that constant fighting was also incredibly expensive and drained their manpower. And remember their biggest weapon, fear. Well, it backfired. They had made so many enemies that everyone was just waiting for a moment of weakness to get their revenge. And eventually, a new alliance of their enemies, the Babylonians and the Medes, saw their chance.
And when the end came, it came shockingly fast. After ruling for 300 years, their capital, Nineveh, was completely destroyed in 612 BCE. And after that, the whole empire just fell apart. In just a few years, the world's greatest superpower was basically wiped off the map.
But even though the empire fell, their ideas didn't. You could say the Assyrians wrote the original playbook on how to build a superpower. A professional army, siege engineering, psychological warfare, efficient government, so many of these concepts were pioneered by them. Their story is a powerful lesson in how power is won, how it's held, and how it can be lost. So it makes you wonder, right? What parts of their strategy do we still see in the world today?